Good evening, everybody. I suggest we get started. You know that the very first portion of this is about logistics and some information. So as more people are joining in, I see the numbers going up. They'll catch up in time. So good evening. My name is Rod Escaiola, and I'm a condo lawyer with Gowling WLG. Welcome to CondoVirus episode 7. Today's episode is titled The Long and Winding Road. For those of you joining us tonight for the first time, well, we've been holding these on a weekly basis for 7 weeks now. And week after week, what we do is we try our very best to provide you with real answers and practical answers to ever-changing challenges that we're all facing. And the situation is so fast moving that in fact our agenda changes on a daily basis. I gotta confess that I was looking forward to the start of the webinar to finally find out what I'd be talking about today, because as of this morning, we were still sort of working on it. Now, every week we get tons of questions from all of you and we build on this agenda, and we thank you very much for sending us questions. Keep sending them. And to get answers to these questions for you, what I do is I call on key industry experts who week after week generously accept to come on board and answer your questions. They answer the call of duty, and here they are again. So I'm going to go around the table and introduce them to you. You'll recognize most of them, but we have a surprise guest today. So going around the table, I'm going to start with our auditing beagle, Brian Antman from Adams Miles. Hello, Brian.
Hi there.
And we have our managers extraordinaire, Sandy Folds from Wilson Blanchard, also speaking on behalf of CCI. Good evening, Sandy.
Good evening.
A phenomenal manager, Catherine Gao, who will be speaking
everybody.
on behalf of ACMO. Thank you for being here again, Catherine. Our condo powerhouse, Denise Lash from Lash Condo Law, also speaking on behalf of the Community Association Institute chapter, Canadian chapter. Hello, Denise.
Hi, everyone.
Hey, thanks for coming again. Our dragon slaying enforcer, Graham McPherson from Gowling WLG. Hi, Graham.
Hi, everybody.
And next in line, you have Goliath. We have David Plotkin from Gowling WLG. Hi, David.
Good evening, everyone.
Next in line, our life and safety expert, Jason Eagle Eye Reed from National Life Safety Group. Hi, Jason.
Good evening.
And our deep dive thinker engineer, Justin Tudor. Hi, Justin, you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Wonderful. So as I said, I'm excited to announce that I've scored another formidable speaker tonight, one of my very favorite condo lawyers, and I can say that because he wasn't here last week when I said the same thing about Denise. We have Josh Milgram from Lash Condo Law. Hello, Josh. How's it going?
Yeah, hi, everyone. Thanks for having me here tonight.
Hey, no problem. So as I said, like we do every week, we get hundreds of questions from all of you. We won't be able to answer all of the questions, and we do our best to pick the most common ones. Keep in mind that many of these questions have been answered in the past, sometimes on numerous occasions, like all the questions about landscaping, for instance. We've touched that, so I'm not sure we're going to touch upon that today. And you can view past webinars, as I said, by going on Condo Advisor. Top right, there's a tab. Webinar tab, and you can see what we've done in the past. And somebody needs to remind me to change the slides on as I move, because otherwise I won't do it. Okay, let me start with the disclaimer as I usually do. So these are the topics we'll cover today, but with the usual disclaimer, we have activated the chat functionality, so all of you are able to chat with each other. Please make sure that you chat with everybody and not just the panelists if you want everybody to benefit from that. And so you should see this on the top or bottom or right or left of your screen, depending on how you're set up. We may not be able to answer every single comment on the chat line, but there's a lot of very knowledgeable people out there. I've seen a few from various CCI chapters. I've seen Michael, I've seen all sorts of people. So I'm sure you're gonna get very good, at least entertaining comments maybe. What else? I'd like all of you to remember the following. While we do our very best to provide you with accurate information and useful information, you got to keep in mind the following. Whenever we refer to legislation, we refer to Ontario legislation. And so if you're listening from elsewhere, and I know some of you are, you need to adapt that to your jurisdiction. Also, please keep in mind that this webinar is recorded on April 29th. And so the information is valid as much as possible as of the date of this broadcast. The information may change if you listen to this later on. And the information we provide you today is general in nature. We're doing our very best to provide you practical advice, but at the end of the day, there's nothing like retaining an actual professional, be it an engineer, an auditor, a manager, a lawyer, to provide you actual answers that are specific to your situation. So we encourage you to do that. This webinar is not legal advice or engineering advice by any means. And finally, the Law Society forces me to tell you that this webinar is being recorded. I don't know why I have to say that, but I have to say that. So it is being recorded. There it is. Now, as I said today, great news. We're not going to talk about landscaping, I promised, but there's a question that came up about window washing. And when I say a question, I mean tons of questions about window washing. So very briefly, is that an essential service? Catherine, what's your position?
No, and I was typing as fast as I could so as not to take speaking time on this. Strictly essential maintenance, repair, and sanitation work is the only thing that is to take place. And much as I would love to say a clean window was one of those tasks, I don't think it is. The more we stay home for the short term, the sooner we can get back to regular business.
And while I agree with you, Catherine, here's the flip side of the medal. I'm going to turn to our security expert, Jason. Any reasons why maybe window washing could make sense in certain cases?
Quite simply, if part of that window washing is an inspection of the exterior panels, the glass panels outside your building. So if you've got a history of a panel falling in the last 12 months, then I would suggest that inspection, you may want to consider going forward. But again, Catherine's right. It's not a health and safety issue, but with that one caveat.
Right. Okay. Very good. See how we can give you two contrary advice at once. No, very good insight. Thank you very much. Now, we usually start with an update on what has taken place this week. And the most significant change this week, of course, is the order in council issued last Friday. So last Friday at 5:45, when most respectable condo lawyers are already deep into their martini glass, the province has issued an order in council, and they've basically changed the Condominium Act temporarily for the duration of the emergency. And we're going to go over that. We're going to spend significant time on this. It's going to be our main topic, in fact. David, any updates maybe on the provincial map to reopening the province? Did you have a chance to look at that?
Yes, for sure. So the provincial government recently put out what has been referred to as a framework or a guide towards reopening. It's really not setting any specific dates or timelines at this time, but it has a few benchmarks that the health authorities are looking towards, at which time they'll be able to start opening up. So that's just to keep an eye on for the future.
Okay, and we'll put a link to that on the Condo Advisor. You'll be able to get a link to that if you want. And Sandy, what on the same topic maybe, what about municipalities? Are we getting any sense of reopening or?
No timelines yet. They're all still working within the provincial or planning to work within the provincial guidelines, but they have not set calendars yet. They're just kind of waiting for a little more feedback from the province on the startup for that.
Okay. Very good. Now let's dive into possibly the most important topic today, and it's the famous order in council. And so there's a summary here, but we're going to unpack that in great details. And the summary is this. So the order in council provides for the following. If your AGM was to be held within this declared period of emergency, you get more time to hold your AGM. You'll have 90 days following the declared period of emergency, or 120 days if your AGM was set to take place in the first 30 days following the end of the emergency crisis. Don't panic. We're going to clarify that in a minute. Also, boards can be called electronically. Boards can be held electronically. And this time around, you don't need the consent of every director. So presently, prior to this order in council, you could hold a board meeting virtually or remotely, but every director had to consent to it. If only one of them didn't consent, then you couldn't do it. The order in council allows you to call them electronically and hold them electronically. Also, all meetings of owners can be held electronically, and you can vote electronically, regardless of whether you have a bylaw permitting it. So that's a significant change. Now, all these changes are for the duration of the period of declared emergency. And again, we'll talk about that in a minute. The last change maybe is that owners can be served with the notices of meeting electronically, regardless of whether or not they've consented to that. So prior to the order, you needed to have the consent of the owner to be able to send them notices electronically. Now, if you have a valid email address, you can proceed that way for the duration of the declared emergency. This is a temporary measure to help everybody sort of function in this crazy time we're in. Okay, so as I said, we'll unpack this, and I'm going to first start with the postponement of the AGMs. Graham, were you covering from this point on, or do you want me to summarize it first and then you'll deal with your scenarios?
Yeah, no, I'm happy to. So as Rod said, pursuant to this new order in council, Section 45(2) of the Condominium Act has been temporarily suspended. And this section is that pesky section that normally requires you to hold your AGM within 6 months after the fiscal year. Now, as a result of this order in council, condos have a lot more time to hold AGMs that were due to take place either during the emergency or within the 30-day period after the emergency ends, whenever that is. And we'll call that the quote-unquote grace period. So more specifically, if your AGM was supposed to take place ordinarily during this emergency, its due date now is by the 90th day after the emergency ends. Now, let's say, hypothetically, I wouldn't hold your breath on this, but let's pretend for a minute that the emergency ends tomorrow, and your condo's AGM was supposed to be on Friday. So this is during the grace period, during the first 30 days after the emergency. Well, now, pursuant to this order in council, you have 120 days after the end of the emergency to hold your AGM. So we're going to play out a few examples of this in a couple of minutes. But what's important to keep in mind is that while this order in council has provided some relief to condos whose AGMs were supposed to take place during the emergency or right after it, the order in council has not affected AGMs that were already late, that were already supposed to occur before this emergency was declared. It has no effect on the deadlines for AGMs that are due more than 30 days after the emergency ends, although we don't know when that will be. And it's not affected the normal due dates of any other types of meetings. And so we'll get into all of that with a few examples.
Okay. Do you want to do your scenarios now, Graham?
Yeah, let's do it. So here's the dates that we're going to be working with for the purposes of going through how this is going to work practically. The emergency began on March 17th, 2020. In this hypothetical world, you know, my fingers are crossed, but I doubt it. In this hypothetical world, the emergency ends on May 15th. This means that the 30-day grace period after the emergency ends on June 14th. So let's go through the scenarios and see how that plays out.
Okay.
When is the meeting due if your AGM was supposed to occur on May 1st, 2020, aka during the emergency? Well, the answer is 90 days after the emergency ends. Remembering in this scenario, we've set the artificial date of the end of the emergency as May 15th, so it would be due by the 13th of August. Now, if your AGM was supposed to be due during the grace period, aka within the 30-day period after the emergency ends, its new due date is 120 days after the end of the emergency, so that would be September 12th, 2020. Now, what if your AGM was supposed to be due on June 30th, and this is outside of the grace period? Well, now, it's still due June 30th. There's been no change at all. Similarly, and I think we're gonna see a pattern developing here, if you have a requisition meeting and the requisition was received on May 1st, that meeting has to be held at the normal time of 35 days after the requisition.
After it's received, yeah, right.
Yeah.
Okay. And so there's no change because
this order only applies to AGMs within the emergency period or the grace period after.
So regardless of whether you get a requisition during the emergency or within 30 days following the emergency, before the emergency or after the grace period, you got 35 days.
Business as usual with respect to the deadline. But as we'll get into, there are some new ways that we can still hold these meetings without breaching the orders of public health officials.
Okay, very good. And that's interesting because not a lot of people picked up on that. A lot of people concluded that all owners' meetings were postponed for 90 days, 120 days. The reality is that this postponement or suspension only applies to AGMs. Very good. Next example, Graham.
Similarly, turnover meetings, their due date is unchanged. It would be the regular deadlines to call and then hold the meeting.
Okay.
And then if your board loses quorum, same thing, you still have that 30 days to hold the meeting.
Okay.
So, oh, Rod, go ahead.
No, I was just going to cut you off and move on, actually.
Okay, I was going to say I'm done.
Okay, very good. So let's move on then. And so the next topic will be, thanks for this, Graham, and you'll all be able to see this because we're going to post the slide presentations. You'll be able to see this online later on. And so Denise, now I'm going to turn to you and maybe tell us what this order in council provides for with respect to e-voting and e-meetings, if you could.
Okay, so I'll start with e-voting first. And as you mentioned before, no bylaw is required to do electronic voting. But again, remember, it's only during this temporary suspension period. Many corporations already have electronic voting bylaws, so there's really no change here. But those that don't have an electronic voting bylaw, what we're suggesting is that you look at it to get some guidelines and to understand what electronic voting is about. And as you know, there's nothing in the order that deals with the procedures or any safeguards. So it's really important to understand what electronic voting is, look at the bylaw for guidance, and then you can pass it at a later date. Then moving on to meetings, and the order of council now allows virtual meetings, online meetings, or electronic meetings. We're calling them different things these days, which is separate from electronic voting. And again, no bylaw is required at this time. Now, this concept of virtual meetings, this is a brand new concept. And remember, prior to the pandemic, it was our position at that time that there was no such thing as a virtual meeting, or it really couldn't be done even with the bylaw. But our position has since changed. So after the pandemic ends, we are recommending that corporations consider doing electronic voting bylaws and also virtual meeting bylaws. Now, right now, there are so many questions about what actually is a virtual meeting. And again, going to the order, there's nothing in there. Just says you could do a virtual meeting without a bylaw. We're recommending, and I know Rod, you and I have talked, and Josh, about what should go in this bylaw. Look at that bylaw. Get it from your legal counsel, so at least you know what procedures to follow, because it is the Wild West out there. And we see a lot of boards doing all kinds of things, going on Zoom, so you really do need to know what you're doing. And the question has now come up after the pandemic ends. If you're sending out your preliminary notice now for a virtual meeting, what happens? Can we continue to do virtual meetings without a bylaw?
Right, yes, so that's a good question. So we're in the emergency declared period. You send out your virtual notice for a virtual AGM, and then the declared emergency comes to an end before you hold the AGM. And so now you're asking a very valid question, which is, are you going to be able to hold a virtual AGM if you don't have that bylaw? And right now, unless the order in council is amended, or unless somebody puts in place some graceful sort of transition, you would not be able to. The day that the declared emergency ends, if you don't have a bylaw, you cannot hold that AGM meeting virtually.
Yeah, which is very interesting. So consider what we're going to have to do if the virtual meetings are called. You're going to have to switch over to an in-person meeting.
Right. And I think, and I'm going to build a bit on what you said about whether or not you should adopt a bylaw. And at the end of the day, of course, the corporations will take the best decision for each corporation. But while we all now have the ability to hold e-meetings and to vote electronically now as a result of the order in council, our recommendation is that you consider adopting the bylaw now in any event, because these bylaws will allow you the flexibility to hold e-meetings and to do e-voting in the future. I mean, now is the future. The future is beautiful. There's no reason to go back, in my view, in time. The benefit, I would say, of these bylaws, as you alluded, Denise, is that, well, they increase owner participation. And forget about the fact we're in a pandemic now. What's going to happen later? If you have a good e-voting bylaw and an e-meeting bylaw, you'll be able to have busy professionals and traveling people and snowbirds and people with limited mobility. They'll be able to participate to these AGMs at a level that they didn't have before. And it also facilitates the attendance of your professionals. I've seen on Twitter and on LinkedIn, some auditors are saying, well, listen, you better line us up now and schedule your meetings with us because it's going to be pandemonium in a minute when everybody wants to hold their AGMs. Well, if you hold them electronically, it's going to provide more flexibility. And e-voting provides the flexibility of allowing more votes from owners. You could, and in fact, you should probably keep the voting open from the notice period from 15 days before all the way to the meeting. Why do you need to vote within the 15 minutes at which we put the ballots in the box? Allow owners to vote and to participate fully. And as Denise said, it's the wild, wild west out there right now, where there's no guidance as to what kind of safeguards should be put into place now for people to hold these meetings. And people do their best, but I mean, people are bound to make mistakes, and not everybody is well-intentioned. And so by having a bylaw in place, a good one, go talk to your advisors. By having a bylaw in place, you have full real-time owner participation and not just you folks watching the webinar. More transparency, more accountability, and proper record keeping. This is not a tea party that you're going to be holding where people are going to watch a webinar and raise their hands and move on. This is a formal, essential meeting that takes place, all the AGMs. So anyways, anything else to add, Denise, before we move on?
No, you've raised a good point there.
David, I'm going to turn to you. What about e-communications to owners and e-board meetings?
So the new order in council for the duration of the declared emergency allows that all notices to be sent to owners with respect to meetings can be sent electronically, again, regardless of whether that specific owner has authorized electronic communications in the past, which is normally required. The same goes for any material required to be put before a meeting of owners. You can place it online by electronic means.
Right. Okay. And some of the questions I see coming up on the chat line is, what about people without computers? Well, so these bylaws, if you adopt them, they don't replace the prior method. They add to it. So people will still be able to hold meetings in person for those who want to attend once it's permitted in the province. So people will still be able to vote in person. People will still be able to vote by proxies. It all depends on what you have in your bylaw. So it's not like everything out the window. It's actually additional flexibility. And also for the duration of the pandemic, for people without a computer, you'll be able to call in. And so as long as you have a phone, you'll be able to call in. Okay, now there's a reason why we got Josh here. Josh has recently chaired his first virtual AGM. And we get a lot of people asking us, well, has anybody successfully done that? And you know what? He's survived it. So here he is. He's going to share his experience with us. Josh, you've done tons of AGMs, but this recent one was your first virtual one. And so what I'd like us to do maybe is go topic by topic and very briefly maybe tell us how it was done and how it could have been better, or share your successes and challenges maybe. And let's start with the notice of meeting. How was that done? How do you send that out and so on?
Sure, Rod. So yeah, we actually last night was the first virtual AGM that I held, and the notice package was substantially similar to what a normal notice package looks like. The only difference is in it, we specifically stated that it was going to be a virtual meeting, no physical attendance, no physical place. And we encouraged owners very strongly to utilize the electronic voting process in advance of the meeting, as opposed to submitting paper proxies, to help sort of avoid and alleviate some of the issues that we might have faced during the actual registration process, and even the virtual attendance by way of proxy. So we were trying to avoid that as much as possible. And fortunately, last night, there were actually no proxies submitted, so we didn't have that issue come up.
Okay, so the purpose, I guess, is to try to streamline people on one channel kind of thing. And it's easier, obviously, if everybody votes electronically, as opposed to whether you have a few proxies on paper, a few e-proxies, a few attending in person, putting, their vote in the hat, and so on and so forth. So you were encouraging people to go with one channel. That sort of makes sense. What about registration, Josh? How did that go?
The registration was, it was half an hour long, like it is in a typical meeting. So from 6:30 to 7 o'clock, there was actually a slide deck on repeat that was giving owners instructions about some of the ways to participate in the meeting and how it's all going to run, so that owners who were waiting after they had already logged in by submitting their names and email addresses to verify that they are indeed owners, they were able to sort of get a sense of what the meeting was going to look like when it started.
Okay. Now, so that's how the user sees it, and they get some instructions, but how does the validation process, the validation portion of registration, how does that work? How do we ensure that, sure, so we know an owner's an owner, presumably because they received the invitation at their email address on record. But what about who validates proxies, and how do you know how to give more weight to one ballot or to one proxy? How do you deal with two spouses, but only one of which is the owner? Like, did that come up at all?
Yeah, so the last one that you mentioned, the spouse issue, did come up, and we talked about it in advance, so we knew how to sort of address it. But basically, if there were two joint owners who attended the meeting, only the latest, they could both attend, but only the latest vote that was submitted would count. So that was sort of dealt with in that sense.
Okay, and what about arrears? How do you know? Well, not so much who's attending, but who's voting. Is there a process? Are you aware if that's sort of implemented?
Yeah, my understanding of that was that the arrears list was provided so that if any owners who were in arrears attempted to vote, that the vote actually wouldn't be counted. Just okay. So at a meeting they wouldn't be given a physical ballot. Here it's a little bit different, but on the tallying side of things, it wouldn't be counted towards the vote.
And one of the reasons why we raise all these questions here, first is to sort of study that new beast and sort of try to see, which end is the front end of this new animal. But also, I want our viewers to sort of keep all these things in mind. There's a lot more to it than just getting a FaceTime account or a Zoom account and then just inviting everybody to just show up. There's a lot of safeguards and precautions and steps and checks and balances that have to be put in place for the AGM to do exactly what it's supposed to be done. This is not going to be a tea party, as I said.
Yeah, 100%, Rod. I completely agree with you. And just to touch on that, one of the things that I wanted to make sure as the chairperson of the meeting was that the meeting mimicked an in-person meeting as much as possible, especially with respect to transparency. It was really important for me as the chairperson that owners were able to see in real time things that were happening, the motions, people who raised their hands, all things like that. And we'll sort of touch on that as we go on here.
Okay. Have we already sort of covered proxies at registration, or do you have anything to add to that?
The only other thing I'd add to proxies is in the notice package, we actually indicated that owners, if they did submit a proxy, they would have to be submitted by a certain time, which happened to be the day before the meeting, just to make sure that we could adequately deal with anyone who attended by way of proxy. Right.
So that allows you to vet them and validate them and so on. Okay.
That's right.
What about quorum? How's quorum calculated? I mean, you got some people that are maybe in the presidential suite, and then you got some people on internet, then you got some people by proxies and votes. And how did that get calculated? Do you know?
Yeah, so we had people who attended online, and they were obviously able to be there virtually. We also had people who voted in advance, and this corporation had an electronic voting bylaw, which deems people who voted in advance to be in attendance at the meeting as well. Again, luckily we didn't have the proxy issue, so we didn't have anyone attending by proxy.
Okay, and so What about are attendees able to see that Joe and Jane and Bob are in attendance? Or is that only visible by the chair? Because if I go to the in-person AGM, I can look around and I see, oh, Jane's there, you know, okay. Do I get to see who's participating?
I don't think that owners, for the majority of the meeting, and I'll get to that exception in a minute, but I don't think owners for the majority of the meeting were able to see the names of other people who were in attendance. They could see how many other people were in attendance.
Okay. Okay. So what about then, let's move on and let's talk about, oh, I changed the order here. Can we talk about scrutineers and the appointment? Did you have scrutineers and how were scrutineers appointed? How does that work?
We did have scrutineers, and they were the service provider that was hosting the meeting actually acted as scrutineers, and they were the ones who sent out the electronic votes in advance, so they acted as scrutineers for the meeting.
Oh, okay. So wait a second here, and I'm not suggesting that anything untoward took place, but I mean, for some owners, that may or may not cause some concerns later on, in the sense that, to me, anyways, and I'm saying this from the outside, the scrutineer is sort of the watchdog appointed by owners for owners. If the scrutineer is a third-party provider, well, I see a benefit. The benefit is that they have no skin in the game and they really don't care one way or the other whether or not you're gonna, the color of the flower bed. They don't care about that. So in that sense, they're removed enough that they could be the scrutineers. But I wonder if that may leave some owners with some questions or concerns where they're not able to appoint various scrutineers from within. So I don't, that wasn't an issue, but that may be an issue.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point, and it's something for boards to consider, maybe different ways of doing that. Perhaps there being some type of mechanism for owners to participate in that scrutineering process as well.
Okay. Moving on to chairing. Who chairs these and how is that done? And I know there's a concept of co-hosts and panelists and like, can you help us sort of demystify this?
Yeah, so, in the same way that you would deal with an in-person AGM, you need to look at the corporation's bylaws to see who is entitled to chair the meeting. In most bylaws, that typically is the president or the designate of the president, so they can designate somebody else. Again, I was able to take advantage of that provision in the corporation's bylaws for the virtual meeting that I had. There is theoretically a mechanism on the platform to have somebody else sort of step in last minute to act as the chairperson. But I think in practice, typically the chair is sort of decided in advance so they can prepare accordingly.
Right. Okay, and what about, and it's an odd question, but did people get to see you, or was it just a voice in the darkness, or was it a picture, or?
Again, trying to mimic an in-person meeting as much as possible, I thought it was important for people to see me as the chairperson. So yes, they did see me as the chairperson, and also the rest of the board. They were also panelists, and people could see them as well. Those who had video available. Okay,
very good. Okay, so we talked about that. We talked about scrutineers. What about motions and appointing auditors? How does that work?
It was actually, it worked out quite well. So again, in terms of transparency, I wanted to make sure that owners would see people making a motion and raising their hands to vote in favor. So the way we did motions was somebody would, the mover and the seconder would raise their hand. And then once they did that, I was able to announce who it was because there was a list of their name and unit number. I was able to announce the mover and seconder. And then we moved to a poll function where all owners could vote in favor or against the motion, whether it was the appointment of the auditor, okay, the approval of the minutes.
Okay, you know what, I'll stop you there. Let's do that. Let's, we're gonna try something live on air for the first time here. How about if all of you folks at home put the popcorn down for a minute and try to find the raise hand button. I don't see it.
I don't see it.
everybody that can find it, you'd probably see it. I think you don't see it, Brian, because you're a panelist.
Oh.
So if you go,
People are pressing it.
yeah, I see it. So right now there's 131 of you who raised your hand, right? So you would find the functionality to raise your hand, and you could raise your hand virtually like that, either because you have a point of order or a question, or because you want to bring a motion. We're at 179 now hands being raised.
And Rod, if I can just interrupt you for a second. So at the meeting last night, we actually had what Rod can see now in terms of who's raising their hand and the order in which they raise their hand. It was displayed for all of the owners to see as well.
Right, and this is crucially important to me, because you don't take my word for the number of hands that I see going up. You need, for me, the platform needs to provide the owners with real-time participation where they see exactly that. They'd be able to see how many hands are up. So that's for raise of hand. We're gonna try the polling now, if I can. And so I'm gonna, everybody, we can stop putting your hands up. I've seen you. There's no point of order. There's no Robert's Rules of Conduct here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to launch a poll. And the question that we're going to ask you, and we'll see if it works. It didn't work last time we tried it, but we'll see if it worked. The question we'll ask you is this. Should you hold your AGM now virtually, taking advantage of the order in council, or should you wait and hold it in person later on after the end of the pandemic? So let me relaunch the poll and let's see what happens. So you should have seen the poll. I don't know if you have. I see some votes coming in, so obviously it's working. And so the question again is, should you hold your AGM now virtually, or do you prefer to wait and hold it later on in person after the end of the pandemic? And on that question, by the way, I'm going to say this. One thing is, it's going to be legal eventually to be in the same room as before, but legal may not mean safe and may not mean wise. Ask yourself that question. How many people will want to go in a room? People don't want to go to the AGM to begin with. Imagine if now you want to go to the AGM following the pandemic. And so the votes are in, and eventually I'm going to share in a couple of seconds, I'm going to share the results. But that's to show you folks at home the difference between raising your hand and doing the poll. So Josh, just so I understand, formal motions were done by polling, and other motions were done by show of hand. Like, can you clarify that with me now?
So all movers and so all of the motions were dealt with the same. For mover and seconder, that was by way of raising hands, so that we could see who does it first for the mover and seconder, and then we switched over to the poll immediately on that same motion to vote in favor or against that motion.
Okay, and the poll, I'll see if I can show the results of the poll. I think it's sort of quiet down now, so I'm going to put end poll, and I'm going to see if I can share the results. I'm not sure if you see these at home. Do you folks, the panelists, do you see it? You do?
Panelists
okay.
do, yep.
Yeah, what about people at
it.
home? People at home, do you see it? If somebody could type yes.
Looks like people are saying yes.
I think they do. Yeah.
Wonderful. Look at that. Look at technology. The future is beautiful, folks. It's going to be amazing. It's all going to be all right. Okay, so that's for chairing, appointment, director's report. Josh, anything to say about that?
The director's report. No, I will say something on the auditor's report. So the auditor was present there, also by video. And
just so you know, we have an auditor on the line right now. Just be careful; he can hear you.
And no problem here. And they were able to bring up the auditor's report on the screen share as well and follow along with the auditor. So I thought that was sort of neat for owners to be able to follow along with that.
Right. Yeah. Wonderful. So we talked about this, candidates, voting. Anything to say about candidates? I don't know if you had something planned for that.
We opened up the floor to nominations. We didn't have any candidates run from the floor.
Okay. And then what about questions and answers? Does everybody gets to see this?
Yes. So how we dealt with questions was people would raise their hand. And again, this was shown to all of the owners so everyone could see who raised their hands. And then we asked them to verbally ask their questions. So we unmuted people one at a time to ask their questions. And we left them unmuted for the duration of the answer in case there was any clarification that was needed or follow-up on that specific question. And then we actually were able to say limit it to one question, and if owners had additional questions, they were encouraged to raise their hand again.
And Josh, was the questions of the auditors, was that did that go okay?
Yes, we dealt with that the same way, just during the auditing portion of the meeting.
Okay.
Okay, wonderful. So this for this. Minute taking, any issues with that?
No, minute taker was there,
Okay.
and had the benefit of seeing all the names and unit numbers as well.
Okay. And so I want to go back to the questions. To me, and to two things you said that to me are very, very important. Your platform has to allow the owners to see the hand raising. It's got to allow them to see the voting results. It's got to allow them to see or hear the questions and the answers. That way you keep everybody honest. I mean, if Graham has this, his annual question on the flower bed and the color scheme, people need to see that he's actually asking it and that the president or the chairperson is dodging it. That to me is very important. And anything else, Josh?
I would just echo your comments and say, there is potential abuse if it's not handled properly. You can have a director who, just flies through the whole meeting, doesn't show anything to the owners. So I think it is important to, put in place a bylaw to sort of specify those processes to ensure that everyone's interests are protected, because that's, at the end of the day, that's what we need to do.
Okay, Josh,
I'm sorry to interrupt, but there was a question from the floor that I think is interesting. Did you record the meeting?
The meeting was recorded, yes.
Okay, another question, Josh. How many units? Give us just a sort of an idea of a size.
The building was about 300 units. We had 30 or so attending virtually and about 90 who had voted in advance.
Okay. Oh, that's interesting. That's very telling, actually. So people don't show up more at virtual AGM as they do in person, but they voted, right? So that's what often we forget, that one of the main purposes of the AGM is for people to vote and approve things. And if they do it electronically, well, you know what? You've met the objective. Okay, wonderful. I'm going to switch topics. Wow, time is flying. The question that we've asked people a minute ago was to hold or not to hold the AGM now. I find it interesting that it's close to 50-50. So 55% of you would wait till the end and hold it traditionally. And about 46% of you would actually hold it right now virtually. And so let me ask our advisors around the table, any legal considerations, Denise, into this debate as to whether or not to hold it now?
Well, I agree with the majority, and the reason I do is because we have this order in council, and the one thing that the order in council refers to is the suspension of AGMs. So why is everybody rushing to have their AGMs during this period? The management industry has a lot on their plate right now. They need to focus on what's more urgent, the health and safety of the residents. So I'm saying, put these off for now, unless you need to hold it for some other reason.
Okay. And so what would be a reason to hold it? I guess, Denise, would be if, what would be a reason to hold it now? If you have a bylaw, a time sensitive bylaw that you'd like to pass, or if you have a director that, a bunch of directors that, they had enough of their term and they want to sort of move on, or if you lose quorum, or I guess there's some issues sometimes, no?
Those are all good reasons. And in those cases, I'd say, yes, you should hold your AGM.
Okay, very good. Managers, what are your views on that, now or later?
Now. In some circumstances, I do think you should have them now. If you have a small corporation, if your corporation normally has very quick AGMs, there's no contentious issues, or if you have a population of technical savvy residents, by all means, let's start this process. If you have long, controversial AGMs, definitely postpone it. You need to do those in person the way you normally would. For portfolio managers moving forward, once the restrictions are lifted, they are going to be so busy, busier than they are now. They're going to be starting up all the restoration projects, rescheduling summer or spring projects, holding board meetings. They're going to be very busy, and they're not going to be able to hold every AGM within the new guidelines of timelines. So some of those easier AGMs, if you can do them virtually, you probably should try.
Okay, wonderful. Catherine, in 30 seconds.
Well, Rod phrased it as complainers gonna complain, which was not my favorite way of phrasing it. But Debbie made mention of the fact that some of our folks who, you know, are prone to conspiracy theories or the fact that the meeting might be hijacked, this all being new and different probably doesn't help any of those thought processes. So Sandy's point, so I'm trying to be sensitive to your community, and perhaps moving to a hybrid meeting after the emergency order is lifted might give you some better clarity on the process, some greater consideration of people who would like to attend in person and still observe physical distancing measures,
Okay.
as well as you know, the back end compliance piece, so that everybody feels comfortable with being able to participate and having those votes and things validated.
Yeah. You know what, at the end of the day, and this is Quebec right now is considering reopening schools, but making it sort of on a voluntary basis. And the conclusion was parents know best whether to send their kids back to school for the couple of weeks that are left. And I think the same could apply to corporations. Corporations know best. Boards, in most cases, know best. And so have a look at your situation, your corporation. Yesterday we had the board meeting at my condo corp, and there's two corporations. We're pretty much acting together because we're joined at the hip, and it turned out that one building wanted to wait and the other building wanted to go ahead with it, and you know, and so it's just based really on the personality of each corporation. We're going to go ahead with ours. And I think my neighboring tower is going to see and try to follow our footsteps and not fall in the same pitfalls and traps and that we will fall in. Auditor, Mr. Auditor, any sort of comments as to now or later?
I mean, we have the capability to do it now. We have the capability to do it later. I guess my fear is that, you know, if we want to do them, a lot of the condo AGMs, sorry, the year ends are December 31st. So if we want to stick with, you know, the 6-month deadline, our window of opportunity to get these meetings staffed is running out the longer the emergency order is in place. So we can accommodate either way. My preference is to start them now so that we're not doing 3 and 4 meetings in a night and can accommodate all of our clients.
Okay, wonderful. We're sort of running out of time, but Justin, I haven't forgotten you. Our engineering STUMPER segment very quickly. Last week, Justin spoke about the HVAC and whether or not it contributed to the pandemic or to the infection rates. And shortly thereafter, the National Post published a piece on that. And Justin, how often have you read it? How many people sent it to you?
12 people, including my mom. Everybody told me I was wrong, apparently.
So what is it? Help us out. And I think
what I said last week. I said everything points to the risk of this virus being transmitted through airborne ventilation systems as very, very low. And then I said the good news is it doesn't matter because the precautions you should take would mitigate the risk of airborne transmission anyways. And then what my mom read was University of Alberta says it transmit airborne, and you're wrong, my son. And instead, what the article still said is, although it might transmit airborne, ASHRAE still recommends running your ventilation systems at full bore to make sure you're controlling the air appropriately. Yeah. So I remain right, just no one cares.
It's okay. Your mom hasn't registered for the webinar, so it's okay. Don't worry about it, Justin. Justin, help me understand this. There's three key pieces to the ventilation system. There's the makeup air unit, there's the fan coil in the unit, and maybe the exhaust fans. Help me understand that, and I think it's going to help us see that there's really very little sort of circulation of air from unit to unit.
Yeah. So fan coil systems or your in-suite system circulates air with tempered air within your unit to control climate. Your exhaust system is in your kitchen and your bathroom that gets air out of your unit and decreases the pressure so as to get rid of odors and viruses in your unit to go outside onto the wall. Your makeup air takes fresh air continuously from the outside of the building, pumps it into the hallways or directly in the unit to make sure the air pressure stays with and doesn't go back out of the hallway or into other people's units.
Okay, so the fresh air that you get in your unit either comes from your windows or from the makeup air unit that's on the roof. You don't get the air from the neighbor.
That's right.
And when you exhaust your air, you're not exhausting it into the neighbor's unit, you're exhausting it outside. And the circulation within your unit is exactly that, within your unit. right?
You got it. Maybe you're the one who can explain it next time and take all the flack.
Next topic for you very quickly, Justin. What signs of building distress should not be ignored during the pandemic?
Yeah, so very briefly, your building's going to talk to you. There's a big and an appropriate desire to defer any work that you can, but don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. If it's a code mandated building system that can't abide an indeterminate delay, if you have a generator that needs to be replaced, if you have a makeup air that isn't working, these need to be responded to. If it's a safety issue, if there's a piece of concrete about to fall off your building, go address that. Or if your leaks are going to, if not addressing a leak is going to adversely damage the building, you should jump on that. If it's leaking into a concrete garage through a wall that's been leaking for 5 years, not as much of a problem as if it's leaking through a penthouse onto a grand piano.
Okay, wonderful. And in 12 seconds, if you are going to proceed with some work, how do you have your papers in order?
Look to your professionals, to either your lawyers, your engineers, or your knowledgeable property managers to provide a letter to the contractor and to the municipality that states the reasons this work is happening under either section 20, 28, 29, or 30. The contractor should reach out to the Ministry of Labor business line. They're very responsive, and they'll make sure that all the paperwork is in order so that the people on site have something in writing that says, this is why I'm here.
Okay, wonderful. Switching topics, safety and security riddle. Jason, I've moved you. You're no longer at the end. We're still at a time, but it doesn't matter. You're not the last one. So help us understand how to deal with emergencies and crisis during the pandemic, and maybe focus your time, if you don't mind, on what have we learned from recent condo fires. There seems to be a lot, or am I imagining this?
No, you're not imagining it. So in fact, Toronto, Hamilton, Brampton, Vaughan, and now Oshawa reported fires increased in the last 4 weeks. So in response, buildings and boards should be doing two things. Number one, we've talked about before, providing those pages from the approved fire safety plan to the residents. They can be done electronically as well. It's something that is considered for building staff. Right now you have a superintendent, concierge, security, and a property manager, an assistant property manager. I would have them always, every 12 months, acknowledge and sign that fire safety plan so that you have evidence that they've read it and they understood it and that training's been completed.
Okay.
Some of the ongoing fire causes, though, of late, to answer your question, balcony fires. And balcony fires have been consistently rising over the last 12 to 18 months. And partly because we store more things out on the balconies. That's partly responsible for that. But we also see drifting cigarettes being launched off of one balcony, blowing in the wind, drifting back onto somebody else's balcony. And then another fire cause that's increased over the last 4 weeks, but it has been historically high over the last 2 years, is cooking. Your building now is occupied at capacity. More people are cooking, and we are seeing an increase in cooking fire. What's the response there? If you can communicate this to the residents, it would be a single basic due diligence step. Some of the lessons learned that we've seen in the recent fires within high-rise or condominiums, normal fire procedures remain in effect. Where do you get those procedures for your staff? Within that fire safety plan. Where do you get those normal and routine procedures for residents? It's also contained within that fire safety plan. For a copy of yours, email your property manager. During evacuation, you will be touching the stairwell doors. You will be touching the handrail. I always insist that everybody enters that stairwell, always use the handrail, because some of these tall buildings are very tall. So once outside your building and you've evacuated, stand clear 150 yards away from the building. You should not be going to the lobby. You should not be standing in the fire route. You should not
light a cigarette.
You should be not having a cigarette. Quite simply, with some fires, we have the opportunity for natural gas leaks. So we want to make sure that we don't light up as soon as we get outside. And then finally, on that point, if you live in a high-rise building, designate with your family members a meeting place where you're going to meet them outside. A lot of fire departments and condo corporations want to identify a preset location where everybody should go. The problem with that is when I get outside, I can't immediately see where my family members are, and that's the #1 priority. So what I like to do is I reach out to my family members and say, we're going to meet at the old oak tree just to the left of the parking lot. So when I come out, I can immediately see if my family members are there and I can account for them.
Okay, wonderful. We need to sort of keep moving. I'm going to jump to the financial section and we'll come back to the management puzzle. Very briefly, Brian, there's this new federal lease subsidy. And I was wondering, does that apply if a condo corp is paying rent, like for instance, for the super suite or whatever it is, do we benefit from that?
I don't believe it applies to condos. The relief is to commercial property owners. There's nothing in what I've read so far that it applies to condos. It is a CMHC program. Having said that, the regulations haven't been issued yet, so that in the coming days, once the regulations are released, there may be some relief, some fine tuning that I can comment on next week. But there is a couple of things that I did want to talk about. First of all, there is a program that is called the Mortgage Payment Deferral Program. It is again also a CMHC sponsored program, although other lenders are offering a similar deferral. It is available for up to 6 months. The agreement is between the corporation and the lender. It's basically a pause or suspension of mortgage payments for those 6 months. Interest still continues to accrue. It is something that is really a cash flow issue. If a corporation needs to utilize that cash for other purposes, it might be an opportunity for them to use that. Although you have to remember that ultimately the debt is still there and you do have to pay it. So you have to think wisely about that. With respect to other loans, there is some other programs that are out there for corporations to defer up to 4 months principal payments on term loans. This could apply to things like super suites and the mortgages on super suites for the mortgage deferral program, guest suites, and other property. Unfortunately, it doesn't apply to leases. So some of the larger buildings where they have these building automation systems that are leased back to the declarants, at this point, it doesn't apply to them. We'll see again in the regulations if that gets changed. I would suggest that you, in every case, speak to your lender, be it a financial institution or even your declarant, because there's a lot of flexibility out there at this point.
Okay, very good. So now back to management puzzle, and my dear managers extraordinaire, we're sort of a bit out of time, so you'll have to pick your favorite topic and be succinct about it.
All right.
So the floor is yours.
Okay, so rule enforcement. This seems to be a big one right now. Enforcing rules during the pandemic when many more people are home 24/7 is becoming very difficult and controversial. While you and your boards shouldn't be totally lax on your rules, it is probably also not the time to start having cars towed out of your visitor parking lots. Most municipalities are also not enforcing their normal street parking rules. So try to be a bit flexible and look for creative approaches to solving concerns before they become a huge dispute or worse, a really bad news media story.
I want to touch very briefly on volunteer work. So we spoke laboriously about landscaping, and I promise I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. One of the sources I'll give you is COVID Just One Friend, and it's modeling of what happens and what the spread of COVID is by having just one friend, just one extra person from your household contact with you. And the reason why I mention that is not doing things like landscaping, not having non-emergency people come and do work at your condominium isn't about stopping you from enjoying your property and making it beautiful. It's about not having extra contacts outside of your own home and the people that you live with regularly. So that's kind of my way of answering, if we're not having a landscaper do it, can volunteers do it? And it's also my way of explaining what is essential. Sandy and I keep getting this question, as do I think every other property manager in what feels like the wide world these days. And I used to answer it with, you know, kind of stop looking for loopholes. And there are others that use more expletives. And what I started asking is, are you looking for my permission? Because I don't think I can give it to you. And at the end of the day, every public health outlet possible is asking you to please stay home so that we can stop the spread. The final thing, in terms of technological struggles, we're all using new tools. I think one of my favorite things about using all of these new tools is we have seen each other as people and as human beings. And so long as we keep doing that and keep caremongering, I think we'll get farther and faster. The final thing that was on our list of emergencies, and then I swear to goodness, Rod, I'll shut up, is mental health, because we are all suffering from cabin fever, is the truth of the matter. Out there are some great tools promoted by the Ontario government, promoted by CAMH. There is mental health first aid. Do please circulate them widely within your properties. Take up a new hobby, learn a new skill. It is always said, and I've seen it on Instagram and Facebook and every other social media posting, if we use this time for something special, it won't seem like a waste of time.
Yeah, I can't thank you enough, Catherine, for having raised this last issue. It's an important one, and we see that a lot of people are struggling, and we see sometimes it's triggered or exacerbated by a compliance letter. And so we really need to be cognizant of that. Thanks for raising that. An important topic for sure. Now, it's pretty much the end of the webinar. We almost managed to fit it within an hour with me poking at people, but not quite. And so I'm going to do like we do every week. I'm going to thank my speakers. I'm going to thank our guests. And I'm going to ask you if you have any sort of words of wisdom or last piece of advice or something that you really wanted to say. And I cut you off. So I'm going to start with Brian Antman from Adams Miles LLP. Thank you so very much for being here with us again. Anything else you want to add?
No, just continue with your social isolation. Be safe and wash your hands.
Wonderful. Sandy Folds from Wilson Blanchard Management, who's been here from the very beginning with us, also speaking on behalf of one of the CCI chapters. Thank you so much. What about you? Any sort of last piece of advice?
Sure. Just keep with doing with what is essential, and try to be reasonable in your corporations. Everyone is struggling, and this is not the time to be really enforcing your rules. Let's work together and come up with creative solutions.
Catherine Gow, speaking on behalf of ACMO, but you're also a manager extraordinaire with Crossbridge. So any sort of parting words?
Same thing as always, keep calm, wash your hands, sanitize your cell phone. There will be lots of new things, and I think some of them are very exciting. So if we try to keep that hat on, we'll probably feel better about all of the new things we learn and all of the struggle that we're suffering through right now.
Okay, Denise Lash from Lash Condo Law, also speaking on behalf of CAI. Any parting words of wisdom?
All the parting words on meetings. Just be careful. These are new platforms. Educate yourself, go slowly, and then you'll have a successful meeting.
Wonderful, absolutely. Graham McPherson from Gowling WLG, great job with the different scenarios. Any words of wisdom before we part?
Yeah, I'm just going to echo Catherine and say, you know, we need to keep trying to make the best of this situation. So, you know, on a condo level, take this time to look into electronic meetings where they're required in the circumstances, or consider adopting a bylaw that will allow you to continue having meetings like that after this emergency ends. And then on a more individual level, you know, now's a good time to, you know, do a good deep spring cleaning, or learn to take up yoga, or experiment with cooking, as long as you do it safely without starting a fire.
Wonderful. David Plotkin from Gowling WLG, thanks again. You've been here with us from the beginning. Any sort of words of wisdom before we go?
For sure. I'm actually going to throw you a curveball this week. I'm normally the be reasonable and flexible guy, but one thing to not be flexible on, you still need to, as we've discussed in previous webinars, I'm going to remind it again, do not be flexible on your registering of liens. They still need to be done according to the Act. If you want to be flexible in some way, do it on the back end with your collection.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Jason Reed from National Life Safety Group.
I am continuously blown away by the passion and the effort and the thought leadership that's been put forth on these conferences and hearing insights from property managers and boards. I've had the privilege of being on calls with security leaders across the province and other industries. And this industry is definitely an industry leader. So I'm blown away by that. So keep it up.
Thank you so very much. Justin Tudor, before your mom dials in from Keller Engineering, anything to say?
Given the option, I'm definitely sending my kids back to school.
Nice. Very good. Okay, and finally, Josh, a newbie today, but I mean, you did all the heavy lifting for us today, and thanks for sharing your experience with us. That was invaluable. Any words of wisdom before we go?
Yeah, I think it's time definitely to embrace technology if you can, of course with appropriate safeguards. But I was quite skeptical prior to the meeting, and it went quite well. So I think it's a good time to do it if it's right for your corporation.
Okay, thank you so much, Josh, for sharing your experience with us. So next week's webinar on May 6th, Wednesday at 5 p.m. I'm looking for topics. I'm exhausted. I'm emptied. It's all dried up. So send me questions, and so we can build on whatever you're going to send us. The information will be posted on Condo Advisor at the very top right. You see there's the webinar link. And so on a regular basis, if you want to see past ones, you can go there. But most importantly, if you want to register for the upcoming one, that's where you do it by clicking there. There's a registration form. So again, we'll see you next week, Wednesday, May 6th at 5 p.m. And in the meantime, I can't thank you enough for having taken all that time away from your lives week after week to tune in and to listen to us. We really enjoy your company, and we really enjoy getting your questions and your feedback. Thank you very much. Everybody, wash your hands, be safe. See you next week. Thanks.